I had just finished my last round of chemotherapy when my mother looked across the dinner table and said, "Honestly, this whole cancer thing, it's been such a burden on us all." She didn't whisper it. She didn't say it gently. She said it with a tone of exhaustion, like I had inconvenienced her with my illness. I sat there in silence, the taste of dry turkey in my mouth turning to ash. My father said nothing. He just continued cutting, his meat eyes focused on his plate as if her words were normal, as if they made sense. I blinked once, twice. Did I mishear her? Had she really just called me a burden for having cancer? My hands trembled under the table. I felt my friend Rachel stiffen beside me. She had been the one taking me to appointments, cooking for me, helping me shower on my worst days. Not my parents, not my family. And yet, here we were. Them acting like they'd carried me through the storm. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the plate at the wall. I wanted to disappear, but I didn't. I smiled. I nodded. And I swallowed every ounce of anger that boiled inside me, because I had learned a long time ago that emotion was weakness in this family, that speaking up meant punishment. But that night, something cracked. Something broke wide open inside me. I didn't know it yet, but that sentence, those words from my mother, were the beginning of the end. Not for my life, but for their control over it. I would go home that night and stare at the ceiling for hours, replaying her voice again and again. A burden, that's what she called me. After everything, after surviving, a burden. After that dinner, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her words looping in my head like a broken record. A burden, that's what I was to her. Not a daughter, not a fighter, not someone who'd just survived 6 months of chemo hair loss, weight loss, nausea, pain, isolation. I was a burden. It wasn't just the insult, it was everything those words implied. That my existence was inconvenient, that my illness had disrupted their lives more than it had destroyed mine. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that maybe she was tired, that maybe she didn't mean it that way. But no matter how I twisted it, the truth was there. My parents didn't see me as someone they loved and wanted to protect. They saw me as a problem to manage an emotional inconvenience. I thought back to the day I got the diagnosis. I had found the lump in the shower. I ignored it for a week, convincing myself it was hormonal, a cyst nothing. But it didn't go away. I went in for a scan alone, a biopsy alone. The day the doctor said the words invasive ductal carcinoma, I drove home in silence, hands trembling on the wheel. I sat in my car outside my apartment for an hour, unable to move. Then I called my mother. She answered on the third ring. When I told her, she paused, then said, "Well, you'll have to let us know how you plan to handle it." That was it. "No, I'm so sorry." "No, we're here for you. Just logistics, management." I remember hanging up and whispering to myself, what did I expect? Because deep down, I knew. This wasn't new. It wasn't just the cancer. It was a lifetime of being viewed through a lens of disappointment. I was the elder daughter who didn't marry early, didn't follow their path. I worked in nonprofit media, not finance or law. I rented an apartment instead of buying a house. I dated casually. I lived my life on my terms. That meant, in their eyes, I was flawed, unstable, unpredictable, and now, inconvenient. I started chemo a few weeks later. I told them my schedule, thinking they might offer to come with me, bring food check-in. Instead, my mother sent me links to articles about diet during chemotherapy and told me to avoid sugar. My father didn't even call. I tried not to let it hurt, but of course it did. Rachel, my best friend, stepped in without hesitation. She sat beside me during every treatment, held my hair when I vomited, changed my sheets when I was too weak to stand. She became my person, not because I asked, but because she knew I needed someone. And still, even after all of this, part of me had held on to hope that maybe surviving something this serious would make my parents see me differently, that maybe they'd realize how alone I'd been, that maybe they'd feel something more than frustration. But no. Instead, I got that dinner, that sentence, that label, and with it came a terrifying clarity. I realized then that if I had died, my mother wouldn't have mourned. She would have managed. She would have organized the funeral, distributed the remaining belongings, made herself the center of the story, and then moved on. And that realization was like falling down a black hole. All my life I had tried to be enough for them, to succeed enough, behave enough, recover enough, smile enough. And here I was, still fighting for breath and still not enough. That was the cost. That was the weight. It wasn't just the cancer. It was carrying the knowledge that even at my most fragile, I was still viewed as a liability. That is a wound chemotherapy can't reach. That kind of grief doesn't come from dying. It comes from knowing you were never fully loved to begin with. The dinner wasn't the beginning of my pain. It was the tipping point, the final crack in a wall that had been crumbling for decades. I didn't become the unwanted child overnight. It started long before the cancer, before adulthood, before I even understood what love should feel like. I grew up in a house where control was love and obedience was survival. My mother, Margaret, was never physically violent, but her words cut like razors. Her expectations were always crystal clear and always just out of reach. A perfect daughter in her eyes was compliant, polished, obedient, and focused entirely on presentation. That was my sister Lily. She smiled sweetly, wore matching bows, got good grades, and never talked back. She was the pretty one, the easy one, the one who made my mother look good. I was loud. I asked questions. I didn't like dresses. I had opinions. I wanted to read instead of help set the table. From the beginning, I was difficult. I learned early on that love in our house was conditional. I once got a B+ in math when I was 10, and my mother refused to let me go to a birthday party that weekend. You need to understand that average is not acceptable in this family. She said, her voice cold and steady. My father, Donald, watched from the other room, pretending to read the paper. That was always his role. Passive, uninvolved. The man who let things happen as long as they didn't disturb his peace. When I got older, the criticism evolved. My clothes were too casual, my job wasn't stable enough, my dating life was embarrassing. Every family gathering was a minefield. If I spoke too little, I was cold. If I spoke too much, I was dramatic. If I didn't call every week, I was selfish. If I called too much, I was needy. Lily, meanwhile, could do no wrong. When she got pregnant at 22, unmarried and broke, my parents turned it into a celebration. A new life is always a blessing, my mother beamed. When I told them about my promotion at the nonprofit where I worked, they nodded politely and moved on to talk about Lily's new baby stroller. I used to think if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself enough, they'd see me, really see me. But every effort was met with indifference or dismissal. Once I sent my mother a framed photo of the two of us for Mother's Day, one of the few where we were smiling together. She never hung it up. When I asked why, she said, "It just doesn't match the color scheme in the living room." I began to shrink in that house emotionally and spiritually. I started curating my words, editing myself, tiptoeing through conversations. I started telling Rachel everything I couldn't say at home. Rachel became my emotional anchor. I met her in college. She was loud, funny, and unapologetic. The opposite of everything I was raised to be, but she saw me. All of me. And never once tried to mold me into someone else. She met my family once during Thanksgiving break sophomore year. Later that night, she told me, "You know they don't see you, right? Like your wallpaper in that house." I laughed it off then, but deep down, I knew she was right. It wasn't that they didn't love me, they loved the version of me they had invented. The obedient daughter who would one day marry well, attend church, and host brunches in a beige dining room. But that wasn't me. It never had been. I didn't realize how deep the rot went until my illness forced me to lean on them. And they weren't there. They weren't just emotionally unavailable, they were resentful. Like my diagnosis had ruined their lives, not mine. My mother didn't offer to help. She offered advice. She didn't visit. She sent articles. My father didn't ask how I was. He asked if I'd considered freezing my eggs. And Lily. She sent a card. No call, no flowers. Just a Hallmark card with "thinking of you" scrawled in handwriting I didn't recognize. That was the moment I stopped pretending. I stopped defending them to my friends. I stopped making excuses for their behavior. I stopped hoping. Because the truth was, I had always been the outsider in my own family, and cancer didn't change that. It only exposed it. The cancer didn't kill me, but their silence almost did. Every week of chemo blurred into the next. The weakness, the nausea, the bone-deep exhaustion, it was all expected. What I didn't expect was how deeply alone I would feel. The kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being physically isolated, but from being emotionally abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me the most. I didn't ask them for much. In fact, I asked for almost nothing. I told them when my treatments were scheduled, hoping they might offer to come with me. They didn't. Not once. I mentioned in passing that I'd lost my appetite and couldn't keep anything down. My mother replied, "You should try ginger tea, and maybe stop eating so much processed food." Rachel, meanwhile, came by with homemade soup crackers, electrolyte drinks, and stayed to wash my hair in the sink when I was too weak to lift my arms. My parents never asked if I needed help getting to the hospital or managing my bills. They never checked if my insurance was covering everything. They never once said, "Do you need anything?" Instead, I got texts, cold, short messages that felt like a chore. "Hope today goes well. Let us know the results. Hang in there." As if I were running a marathon and not fighting for my life. There was one day in particular I'll never forget. I had just come back from my 5th chemo session. My body felt like it was on fire. My mouth was full of sores, my fingers tingled with numbness, and every step I took felt like dragging cinder blocks. I called my mother, desperate to hear something comforting. Anything. She picked up after the 4th ring. "Hi, Mom." I croaked, my voice barely audible. "I'm not doing great today." There was a pause, then a sigh. "Well, sweetheart, I told you cancer was going to be hard. You just have to be strong. Complaining won't help." That was it. That was the end of the conversation. I stared at the phone after she hung up, my heart pounding, my eyes dry, not from strength but from pure depletion. I remember thinking if I disappeared tomorrow, would they even notice? And more disturbingly, would they be relieved? Would they feel less burdened? Every family interaction became a performance. I forced myself to attend Lily's baby shower wearing a wig that itched and makeup that barely concealed my pale skin. I smiled. I posed for photos. I gave her a handmade quilt I spent weeks sewing during radiation. And when I handed it to her, my mother leaned in and whispered, "Try not to make this about you today, okay?" I nearly choked. I hadn't said a word about my illness. I hadn't mentioned the treatments or the fatigue. I was trying to be invisible, and still I was too much, too present, too inconvenient, too broken to fit the mold of the perfect, polished older sister. After the party, I cried in Rachel's car, mascara streaking down my face, my wig balled up in my lap like a discarded costume. I told her I didn't think I could keep doing this, pretending that their distance didn't hurt. Rachel didn't say, "It'll get better." She didn't say, "They mean well." She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You don't owe them your suffering." That sentence hit me harder than any chemotherapy session. It burrowed into my chest and refused to leave. I had been taught to believe that loyalty to family was sacred, that respect meant silence, that survival meant pleasing them at all costs. But Rachel was right. My pain wasn't a tax to be paid in exchange for love. My illness wasn't a negotiation, and yet that's what it had become. Every call from my parents felt like a transaction. Every interaction was layered with unspoken disappointment, subtle blame, emotional manipulation. I was tired of performing, tired of earning, tired of pretending that their indifference didn't cut me to the bone. But the real turning point came when I found a crumpled envelope on my kitchen counter. My mother had mailed it along with a letter addressed to my darling Emily. I opened it with trembling hands, foolishly hoping for warmth. Instead, the letter was a list of suggestions how I should approach recovery, diet, work, relationships. It ended with a single line. "We hope this ordeal has taught you the value of discipline." That was the day I stopped trying. That was the day I realized I could die tomorrow, and their grief would be measured in inconvenience, not love. That was the day the love I had for them began to rot. And once love starts to rot, it becomes something else entirely. Something heavier, darker. Something dangerous. It was late October when I decided to finally put my affairs in order. The treatments were working, the doctors were hopeful, and my body was beginning to heal. but something in me had shifted permanently. I no longer lived under the illusion that I was surrounded by unconditional love. And as much as that hurt, it also gave me clarity. I decided to write a will, not because I expected to die, but because I knew I needed to take control of anything that belonged entirely to me. It wasn't about money. I didn't have much, but I had some savings, a modest life insurance policy, and the beginnings of a retirement account. More importantly, I had things that mattered to me: letters, journals, photo albums, a few pieces of jewelry from my grandmother. I wanted those items to go to people who truly loved me, people like Rachel, people who showed up. I drafted the will myself, sitting at my kitchen table in sweatpants with a heating pad on my stomach. I left Rachel the bulk of my belongings. A few friends received items with sentimental value. I included a letter for each of them, and I included my parents too at first. I left them a small portion of my savings, some family heirlooms, and a note that simply read, "For everything you gave me, even if it wasn't what I needed. It was restrained. It was respectful. It was undeserved, but I still wanted to believe they might one day understand." I left the draft sitting on the desk in my office. A few days later, I came home from a doctor's appointment to find my mother sitting in my apartment. She had used the spare key I'd given her years ago. I was too tired to argue. I sat down, asked if she wanted tea. She declined. Her lips were tight, her eyes scanning the room like she was evaluating something. Then she saw the draft of the will. She picked it up without asking. Read it silently. Her face flushed. "So, this is how you see us?" she asked, her voice trembling with controlled rage. I opened my mouth to explain, but she held up a hand. "Don't bother. I should have known. All this time we've been supporting you through this nightmare, and this is the thanks we get." My jaw dropped. Supporting me. Was she serious? I started to respond, but she was already on a roll. "You've always had this victim complex, Emily. Everything is always about you. Your feelings, your struggles, your needs. You're so self-absorbed you don't even see what this has done to us. What this has done to you." I said, my voice cold and steady. "I had cancer. You sent me diet tips." She waved that off. "We're your parents. We shouldn't have to coddle you. We taught you to be strong. Clearly you missed that lesson." I was shaking. The insult wasn't new, but hearing it framed as parenting philosophy made it worse. Then she said the sentence I'll never forget. "You've always been the emotional one, the dramatic one. And now you're the expensive one too." She spat the last part like it was venom. I stared at her. My own mother, standing in my home, calling me expensive like I was a bad investment, a failed project, a sunk cost. That night I changed everything. I tore up the original draft of my will. I wrote a new one. I took my parents out completely, not out of revenge, but out of truth. They hadn't earned a single cent, not one heirloom, not one letter. I realized then that my deepest pain hadn't come from the cancer. It came from loving people who could look me in the eye and still see nothing but inconvenience. That's when I knew I had to burn the fantasy to the ground. I mailed them a letter the next day. It was short. It read, "Going forward. I expect no support from you, and you should expect nothing from me. You taught me that love has terms, so I'm setting mine now. Goodbye." I changed the locks. I blocked their numbers. I sat with the silence and let it fill every corner of my apartment, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Not joy, not relief, but peace. The kind that comes when you finally stop pretending. After I sent the letter and cut them off, the silence was deafening, but not lonely. For the first time in my life, the quiet wasn't filled with dread. I didn't wake up checking my phone for their messages or dread Sunday calls filled with veiled criticism. Instead, I started breathing again. Rachel came by more often, bringing her dog and enough food for 3 people. She didn't ask questions. She didn't dig. She just existed in the space with me, giving me something my family never could, the right to feel everything. And that's when I started group therapy. It was something my oncologist had suggested early on, but I'd brushed it off. I wasn't the type I thought. I didn't want to sit in a circle and cry with strangers. But now, after everything I realized, I needed connection, not advice. I needed people who didn't look at me like I was broken. The group met every Tuesday night in a small room at the Cancer Support Center. There were 7 of us, all survivors or patients in treatment. Different ages, different diagnoses, different lives. But within 10 minutes, I felt more seen than I had in years. I told them about my parents, about the way they dismissed my pain, about the burden comment. I expected judgment. Instead, I got nods. I got understanding. I got validation. One woman, a breast cancer survivor named Janice in her 60s, looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You're not crazy. They're cruel. Some families don't know how to love unless it's easy." That sentence stuck with me for days. Some families don't know how to love unless it's easy. I had made excuses for them my whole life. I told myself they were old-fashioned, strict, reserved. But the truth was, they were lazy with their love. It only existed when I was performing. It vanished the moment I needed them. At another session, a man named Robert, who had survived leukemia, told us about how he'd stopped speaking to his sister after she laughed when he cried in front of her. "It's not about the moment," he said. "It's about what it reveals. You see who they are when you're at your worst." That was exactly it. Cancer didn't change my family. It exposed them. I started journaling, more writing letters I'd never sent, trying to make sense of the years I spent chasing affection like a starving child. And I kept coming back to the same truth. I wasn't loved for who I was. I was tolerated when I was convenient. That realization should have destroyed me, but it didn't. It set me free. Because if their love was conditional, then their rejection wasn't my fault. Their cruelty wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of their limits. And suddenly, I stopped asking why. Why didn't they call? Why didn't they show up? Why couldn't they love me the way I needed? The answer didn't matter anymore. It wasn't about me. It never was. The day I took back my power wasn't dramatic. There was no public showdown, no screaming match in the middle of a family event. It was quiet, calculated. It began with a phone call I didn't answer. Then another. Then a voicemail from my father's number, his voice stiff and formal. "We heard you've made some changes. Your mother's upset. We'd like to talk this through." I deleted the message, not out of spite, but because I was done explaining myself. The moment I wrote them out of my will, I had already begun rewriting the script of my life. From that point forward, I wasn't the daughter who begged for approval. I was the woman who survived without it. I started showing up differently to my friends, to work, to myself. I said no without guilt. I asked for help without shame. I allowed myself rest. I went back to work part-time, easing into projects that made me feel alive. The first campaign I led after treatment was a fundraiser for underinsured cancer patients. I poured everything into it, my story, my pain, my determination, and we raised more than I thought possible. People responded not to pity, but to power. Survivors emailed me. Strangers sent letters. One note from a woman in her 50s simply read, "Your words made me feel brave. Thank you for saying what I couldn't." I taped that note to my fridge. I saw it every morning and reminded myself that surviving wasn't just about staying alive, it was about reclaiming the right to be fully human. Rachel and I took a weekend trip to the coast. We rented a cabin, drank wine, stayed up too late watching terrible movies, and walked barefoot on the beach. At one point, she turned to me and said, "You seem lighter, not just healthier." Lighter. I nodded. Because it was true. I had been carrying the weight of my family's disappointment for 34 years. And finally, I had put it down. That feeling of putting it down wasn't a single moment. It was cumulative. It was refusing to return their calls. It was deleting the shared family calendar. It was deciding not to send a birthday card. It was choosing to live like I mattered even when they never said I did. And it all came to a head 2 months after the will incident. My cousin Lauren was getting married. She was one of the few extended family members who had always been kind to me quietly in the background without drama. She invited me with a handwritten note. I wanted to go, but I knew my parents would be there, so I made a decision. I would go, but I wouldn't play nice. I wouldn't pretend. I would show up as myself fully, unapologetically, and without the invisible leash they'd always held. I wore a black silk dress that made me feel powerful. I walked in with Rachel, who wore red lipstick like armor. The moment we entered, I felt the tension. My mother froze when she saw me. My father's eyes narrowed, but I didn't shrink. I smiled at Lauren. I hugged her tightly. I complimented her dress. I danced. I laughed. And when my mother finally approached face stiff and eyes sharp, I didn't flinch. "Emily," she said, "we were hoping to speak with you." "Now's not the time," I replied coolly. "I'm here for Lauren." She blinked. Thrown off. Not used to boundaries. "We didn't expect you to cut us off so coldly," she said. It was painful. I tilted my head. Imagine how I felt. Hearing I was a burden, watching you vanish when I needed you most. She opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. "This isn't the place. And frankly, you've had enough chances." Then I turned and walked away. Rachel followed, grinning. "That was hot," she whispered. I exhaled. My heart was racing, but not from fear, from power. That night I danced like I hadn't in years. I didn't worry about how I looked. I didn't scan the room for judgment. I existed, and for the first time, that was enough. The fallout came quietly at first. After the wedding, I didn't hear from them for weeks. Not a text, not a call, not even one of those impersonal holiday e-cards my mother usually forwarded with no personal message. I thought maybe they had finally accepted it that I was gone, that I had chosen myself over them. But I should have known better. It wasn't in my mother's nature to be silenced without retaliation. She thrived on control, and when she lost it, she didn't let go, she regrouped. It started with an email to my employer, a formal complaint disguised as concern. She claimed I had mental instability following cancer treatment and suggested they monitor my behavior closely. I was lucky. My boss was someone who respected me deeply. She brought the email to me directly, her face tight with disgust. "Do you know a Margaret Carter?" she asked. Unfortunately, I said, "She's my mother." We both laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was chilling. I realized then that this wasn't just estrangement, it was war. Not loud, not explosive, but calculated, personal, insidious. My mother didn't want reconciliation. She wanted to regain control by any means necessary, and yet it didn't work. My boss dismissed the email as vindictive nonsense and assured me my position was secure. But the attempt shook me. It reminded me how far she was willing to go to reassert dominance. A few days later, I found out she had called Rachel, tried to reason with her, tried to frame me as ungrateful, emotionally unstable, easily manipulated. Rachel recorded the call, played it for me. I listened to my mother speak about me as if I were a stranger, some problem child who had turned her back on the people who did everything for her. My father never reached out directly, but I heard from an uncle that he was embarrassed by my behavior, ashamed that I'd made a scene at Lauren's wedding. No mention of the words that pushed me away. No acknowledgement of their absence when I needed them. Only bruised egos and the need to control the narrative. But something unexpected happened too. A shift. A ripple. Other family members began to reach out not to scold me, but to quietly, carefully tell me they understood. A cousin sent a message, "I've always admired your strength. I just never said it." An aunt I barely knew wrote, "I saw how your mother treated you. I wish I had said something sooner." The isolation I feared started to crack. And in its place, a strange, cautious network of support emerged, not loud, not dramatic, but real. And that in itself was a kind of justice. Because while my parents still clung to their story of betrayal and disrespect, the truth was seeping out. Slowly, relentlessly, and it wasn't me who looked bad. It was them. The strange thing about healing is that it doesn't always come in waves. Sometimes it arrives in whispers in the quiet moments when you realize you've gone an entire day without thinking about the people who used to own your mind. That's what it felt like in the months after I walked away. I was still rebuilding, still processing, but I was also breathing easier. The nightmares stopped. The anxiety loosened its grip. I started waking up with something new inside me space. I filled that space slowly, deliberately. I joined a yoga class for survivors. I started volunteering with a local support group, sharing my story in rooms filled with people who knew what it meant to lose control and fight to get it back. I went back to therapy and stopped censoring myself. I said things like I deserved better out loud and didn't feel ashamed. Rachel and I deepened our friendship into something like family. She became my emergency contact. I became her child's godmother. We celebrated our wins over coffee and cried over losses in each other's arms. It was the kind of love I'd always wanted, one with no strings, no scoring system, no passive-aggressive jabs hidden in polite smiles. One afternoon, I received a letter. Not from my parents, but from Lily. It was long, handwritten, clearly edited several times. She apologized for not being there, for believing our parents' version of me for so long, for not realizing how much I had endured alone. She didn't ask for anything. She just wanted me to know she was sorry, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a small softening in my chest. I didn't reply right away. I wasn't ready, but I didn't tear it up either. That was progress. At work, I thrived. My boss noticed the change. "You seem more grounded," she said during a meeting. "More yourself." I smiled. "I think I finally figured out who that is." I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. Not to them. Not to anyone. I wore what I liked. I spoke my mind. I went days without thinking about whether I was disappointing someone. I was no longer trying to earn love from people who only knew how to weaponize it. I wasn't surviving. I was living. 6 months after I finalized the new will, I received another letter from my mother. The handwriting was shaky, the paper more elegant than usual, as if she believed a nicer envelope would soften the impact of what she'd done. I debated whether to open it, but curiosity won. It wasn't long. 3 short paragraphs. The first offered a vague apology. "I may have spoken too harshly during your illness," she wrote, as if her words had simply slipped out instead of being deliberate daggers. The second asked if we could meet to discuss the family dynamic. The third ended with "Love, Mom," like the word could erase decades. I folded the letter, tucked it in a drawer, and never responded. Not because I was angry, but because I was done. My silence wasn't revenge, it was a boundary. One I had earned, one I intended to keep. I realized then that healing isn't about fixing the people who broke you. It's about no longer letting them decide how you see yourself. I had spent so long trying to be a version of me that would make them proud, smaller, quieter, more compliant. But pride, born from submission, is just control in disguise. I wasn't interested in their approval anymore. I was interested in my freedom. I hosted my own birthday that year, surrounded by people who had carried me through the worst. Rachel, my coworkers, survivors from my support group. No one brought up my parents. No one asked why they weren't there. Because it didn't matter. That chapter had closed, and for the first time I didn't feel the urge to reopen it. When I stood to give a toast, I looked around the room and felt a warmth I had never known in my childhood home. I spoke plainly. This past year nearly broke me. But it also showed me who I am, and more importantly, who I'm not. I'm not someone who begs to be seen. I'm not someone who explains her worth, and I'm not a burden. The room erupted in cheers, not because I was cured, but because I was clear. A week later, I had a final meeting with my lawyer to update my estate plan. We walked through every line, every beneficiary, every clause. When we finished, he smiled and said, "This is one of the clearest, most intentional wills I've seen in a long time." I nodded. It had to be. It's not just about where things go. It's about where I no longer go. Walking out of that office, I felt light. Not because I had disinherited my parents, but because I had reclaimed my right to decide what love looks like and, more importantly, what it doesn't. They taught me that love could be cruel. I taught myself that love could be a choice. And I chose better.